So let's take it one step at a time. What are the steps though? The first step, if you would like, is to gather different ideas bank resources that are out there that would give you ideas on activities that you can use to engage youth during your sessions. When you gather all this information, always be mindful about the audience and about inclusivity. Always be aware that just because you found something out there and just because it worked great for them, that you still need to tailor it to your needs. Then once you find what you need, give it a go, and then we're going to talk about so first look into implementation, taking it one step at a time. In this segment, we're going to talk about gathering your idea bank resources. We're going to talk about audience and inclusivity, STEM lesson tailoring, giving it a go, and sharing ethics. So let's start with our ideas banks. First of all, the first step is to invest in ideas banks. Why do we do that? We do that because by doing so, we get into a process that allows our creativity to be stimulated. And as we go and as we do that, our brain gets some sort of training that allows us to slowly be able to see the connections more easily, to bring things together in a classroom, to connect different activities that otherwise we would have not seen a connection between the content that we want to put across there with an activity. The other reason why investing in ideas banks and gathering all that information together is that long term it will save you time, because you will have that information there. When you're in a rush, you can just click on it, find the activity that suits that session's theme, taking it, tailoring it, and then obviously implementing it. The other thing that you could do with ideas banks, as much as that is great for you, what you could also do is you can actually get your youth participants involved, and you can actually pass on some of the responsibility for creating energizers to the youth participants themselves. And the reason why you would want something like that is by doing that, you give them ownership. It becomes a little bit of a learner-led lesson. There's a little bit of a co-worker relationship, and of course there's pride involved when they do that. What they can learn from that, other than the responsibility associated with it, they can definitely learn some project management skills, because any activity, however small, will require them to project manage, meaning that they're going to have to find the materials, they're going to have to make sure that they're approved, they're safe, there's enough for everyone. There's a whole process associated to it. It's the same process that you would have to do, but then they take on that responsibility. The other thing that they will learn from something like that is that they will have to learn the process of researching. How do we find and how do we use resources? How do we know that those resources are trusted resources? And then how do we evaluate also if it is the right activity for us? When we talk about evaluation, however, we also talk about it in terms of, okay, how can we use activities, how can we use idea banks to evaluate where our youth participants are at? By observing them in the process of trying out an activity, we can see whether or not they need help with certain things, if they're really good at something, what are their needs, what are the dynamics in a group. And one of the last points, but definitely not the least points of why investing in an idea bank is so important, is because your youth workers themselves can see the effort that you put in it. They know that you're working hard. And for example, if, let's say, you had asked your classroom, or your youth group rather, what would you like to do next week? What kind of activity would you like me to bring into our sessions? And they say, our typical example would be sports in this case. They would say, we'd like something more active. We'd like to go outside. And you do that. They will appreciate you so much more. First of all, that you listen to them. but then that you listen to them enough and cared enough to actually put in the effort to follow their ideas. And when they see that, a different bond, a different trust will be created in your group, and they will open up more. It will be easier for you to help them and for you to learn also from them. Some ideas banks, which I would suggest, are Plastic Challenge, Steve Spangler, Six Science. Pinterest, of course, is a resource that can give you amazing ideas. Instagram is definitely another one, but I would also be a bit more specific in regards to how to use it. You can type in tags like homeschool community, and when you see the work of some of these homeschool parents, you will be amazed at how creative they are. Another ideas bank is Science Capital, Get Engineering, Youth Camp open source manuals. Again, we'll probably keep coming back to these youth camp and summer camp manuals, as they are amazing resources. Marvin and Milo. And then there is a book called The Lesson Imaging in Math and Science. And what it does is, and I think it's a fantastic tool, I definitely use it, just like the title suggests, it explains to you the process of imaging or imagining what could happen in a classroom if you were to implement an activity and you start from scratch. As in the morning, for example, your students come in the classroom, you open the door, you can even imagine Michael's facial expression, or John's surprise when you bring his favorite toy in a classroom. Just a very random term, toy, but in any case, you imagine how the experience would turn out, and by doing that and by getting into such a state, you can also start to plan better, you can start to predict things, and essentially it definitely allows you to be way more organized before you actually implement it. Now, moving on to the next point, let's talk about audience and inclusivity. So when we talk about your audience and the youth members that you have there, because we live in such a diverse world, it's very likely that you will have youth participants that might have come from a different culture. Obviously, a gender might also be different. Now, we understand that there's a lot of homework to be done in understanding how one identifies. Then we also have the category of special needs. And when we talk about something like that, for example, if you're going to do an activity that's interactive, if it requires one to run, make sure that is an activity that even someone with a wheelchair, for example, will be able to participate in. You don't want to leave people out. There's nothing worse than leaving people out and excluding them. Not only because it obviously will be associated with feelings of neglect, but it will definitely create a sense of we're not actually a team. And when that happens, bonds start to break, trust gets lost, and it moves on from there. There's also a disadvantaged group. We need to consider, where is someone coming from? Could we have refugees in our group? How are we sensitive towards that? And how do we, I wouldn't say protect, but how do we empower people no matter where their background is from? What is very interesting, and I do suggest that you take it, there is a test through Harvard University about checking your implicit bias, and what it shows, there's different tests. For example, through these testing periods, you might actually realize that without knowing, you would have favored, for example, a slimmer person for a job, a white person for a job. For whatever reason, there are different biases involved that we have been conditioned to turn to without our realizing, but perhaps if we know that they exist, we can start addressing them, and that is a place to start. Another one is definitely, and it is a topic that goes beyond this module, and I'm definitely not the person to speak about it, but I understand that representation in STEM and in anything that we do is very, very important, and that we have a lot of work to do, because as much as someone might say, for example, in my youth group, I have people of different racial backgrounds, I care for all of them, I'm not racist, but to not be racist and be anti-racist for can be an entirely different thing. Edit that part out, please. Just some quotes and some findings here. On average, across EU countries in 2015, around 3 in 4 native-born students, but only 3 in 5 students with a migrant background attained the baseline level of proficiency in the 3 core PISA subjects: science, reading, and mathematics. Now, I'd like to make a point here, and when it comes to STEM, a lot of the times we think, okay, I'm in a working environment, I'm in a learning environment, we're doing STEM and a STEM hands-on activity, and it is open for everyone to see, whether regardless of their background, but to be exposed to it by just being in the environment and participating is an entirely different thing. And while this comparison with this quote I'm going to say next might not be the exact same thing, I think it's important for us to consider this next quote. Which, when I read this I was quite stunned. It says, equality is giving everyone a shoe. Equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits. Dr. Nahid Dosani. Now that's a really powerful quote, and one that we need to think about a little bit more, for us to be a bit more intentional about how do we use STEM activities in a classroom? How do we make sure that it is inclusive, that everyone gets a chance to participate, but also participate and be engaged in a meaningful way? Recently, and I'm not going to go really much into this, but cut. Another quote, women make up only 28% of the workforce in science, technology, engineering, and math, and men vastly outnumber women majoring in most STEM fields in college. The gender gaps are particularly high in some of the fastest growing and highest paid jobs of the future, like computer science and engineering. Which is, these findings of course are extremely problematic. What's perhaps ironic is that the term STEM itself, and this was something that was mentioned in the beginning, was actually coined by women. It was SMED before, and it was an acronym that no one really remembered much. But then a female biologist changed the acronym to what we know today. And yet we see such a difference in percentages between women and men in STEM. So what does that say to us? Clearly we're not doing enough in pushing for women and girls to be involved in STEM, to making them feel that they actually can take part in it, they can be great in it. And this is another reason why representation is so important. Another one, Blacks and Hispanics made up around a quarter, 27% of the overall US workforce as of 2016, but together they accounted for only 16% of those employed in a STEM occupation. You can find more details and statistics about this in the resource that we found this information, which is referenced at the end, which is about access to education for refugee and migrant children in Europe as well, and a few other studies that will be referenced at the end of the presentation. So, we've talked about inclusivity, meaning that yes, we can find an idea out there which is fantastic, but we need to tailor it. And how do we need to tailor it? We need to make sure that it's practically feasible in so many respects, as in, can we actually do it? Do you have enough time to prepare for it? Does the board at your school or your youth center, does the policy allow you to even do that? If not, is there a way around it? Is it age appropriate? If you need to go outside, if it's an outdoor activity, you need to make sure that the student, or rather the adult to student ratio is such that it would make sure that there will be an adult supervising a number of students. Is the space adequate? If they are moving around, is there enough space, or are they going to get hurt at the corner of the desk? If you do have someone in a wheelchair, will that space that you're in, will it allow them to move? Will it allow them to be engaged in that activity? What are the available resources? And when we talk about resources, we mean, is it an activity that requires a lot of technology? Do you have that? If not, is there another version of it? For example, when we talk about coding in STEM, a lot of people might be surprised to know that you don't have to use a computer when you start being introduced to coding. To actually understand the principles of coding requires such logical and such logical thinking that it can actually start with a piece of paper, a pen and paper, a board. You can do that through movement. You don't actually, to understand the core principles, the problem solving skills associated with it, the creativity with it, you don't actually need a computer. You don't need as much technology as one might think in the beginning. So are there ways around it if you don't have all the resources that might initially be indicative to be needed? Then health and safety. With an activity, for example, like the marshmallow and spaghetti pyramid. With the marshmallows that you might have there, you might have people that might be allergic to certain. So with health and safety, let's say that your activity involves using the senses to be able to identify what is around you and or what food category something falls into. If, for example, one of the food items that one is to test is bread, and someone is allergic to gluten, they're celiac or they're intolerant, that can actually cause a lot of problems. So you have to know things like that. Do we have allergies? Are there other health conditions that we need to be aware of? Then the other thing when we talk about STEM activity and lesson tailoring is that you have to always keep in mind, of course, activities are fantastic to use for all the reasons that we mentioned, and we will mention also later on when we talk about energizers. However, they have to be linked to your curriculum, to the skills that you need to help them develop, to the process that your policy requires that you follow. But above all, I think obviously, as with the content, make sure that there, for our context also especially, is that there's an employability skills linked to it. As in this activity that they're doing, Of course, there can be a knowledge aspect to it, there can be a technical aspect to it, but make sure that you're asking the kind of questions, you're pushing the kind of processes, the details that would allow for them to practice the life skills that are necessary in the work environment, whether they're an employee or an entrepreneur, either or, it would be necessary in both. So once you do that, and once you start with that process and you're starting to feel a bit more comfortable, or even when you're not still, because it might take some time for you to feel comfortable. And in our case right now, the assignment is the following, for you to give it a go. So what you could do is you could go back, once this slide is over, you can look at 3 of the idea banks that were provided and use them to search for educational STEM activities that relate to the professional context that you're in as youth workers, but also that relate to the content that you might have to deliver. In our case, that has also to do with entrepreneurship and being successful and productive in the work environment. You can use the ones that were provided there. You can also use ideas for STEM activities that you might already have. Second point, start taking notes on activities that look promising to you and that you could potentially use in the near future. And the third point is work on creating your own idea bank library. So if you do, going back to point 1, if an idea or an activity that you yourself have used in the past, whether as a youth, as a young person yourself, try to build on it. Don't take necessarily an activity that you have already done, you already have tested it, is tried and tested. Take something new, challenge yourself, use a resource that you haven't before, and so on. All right, let's talk about sharing ethics. When we talk about sharing ethics, I think the first thing that comes to mind, and of course, if it does come to mind, I'm very glad that that's the case, is giving credits where credits are due. Of course, if we use something that was someone else's idea, do give references or do give thanks. What doesn't really come to mind that often when we talk about sharing ethics is that actually we have the responsibility ourselves to use the good that is out there. If we don't do that, it means that we, first of all, obviously we're not growing, we're not progressing, we're not becoming more effective, but we're actually limiting the experiences that our youth participants could have. We do have the responsibility to not just give them what we might know, but if we don't know something, to be humble enough to use the good that's out there, bringing it into the classroom and liven things up and engage them as much as we can. I think this next point obviously goes with the first one, which was copyrights. If there are copyrights involved, always do mention them. And again, give credits where credits are due. In regard to sharing ethics, a lot of the time we do complain about different problems that are out there, or we might get frustrated that we need a resource right now that doesn't exist. If something like that doesn't exist, if you need help, be a part of the solution, create something yourself, collaborate with someone else. Take that responsibility also of sharing. So if you have created something yourself, just like you used the work of someone else earlier, you too need to take on the responsibility of sharing, of giving back. And to bring this part to a close, as part of the sharing ethics, when we talk about giving and taking, invest in a community of youth workers that are open to give and to take and give you feedback also, and open to listen to your feedback so that together you can give the best that you can to the youth participants that you're trying to reach. Here are some of the references that you can take your time looking at. You've got the Wellcome Trust. A lot of the ideas banks came from there. You've got the implicit Harvard study that we talked about. The lesson imaging book, you've got the link right there from Amazon. And some of the papers about inclusivity in STEM. So that is it, and I will see you in the next segment.